All right, guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am Aaron Freeman, joined by my co-host Scott Karasik, and today we are chatting about the Falcons' recent win in the wild card against the Los Angeles Rams. We're going to be previewing their upcoming divisional round matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, and of course, we'll be answering all you guys' mailbag questions on and throughout and at the end of the show. So, Scott, let's kick things off. We don't have any roster moves to talk about on this week, so let's jump right into last week's matchup against the Rams. Falcons won the game 26-13. They were able to create two turnovers, generated 6 points off of those turnovers. They were able to hold Todd Gurley to 43 yards rushing through the first three quarters. He wound up getting 58 in the fourth quarter to put him over the 100-yard mark. But the Falcons were really reliant on the running game. Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman combined for 32 carries, finished with 106 rushing yards, also added 31 receiving yards on four combined catches as well. So a lot of the offense went through the Falcons running backs, and they were able to take out Todd Gurley as well and keep the number one scoring offense in the league to under 13 points. So, Scott, what are your thoughts on that game?
I thought they did really well. I had to go back and rewatch the game a couple times just because of what I was doing Saturday. But Devontae Freeman impressed me the most out of anybody. The line wasn't really able to create a lot of push against that really, really, really good not St. Louis, LA Rams line. But he still created what he could. And there were a lot of times when they gave him -4 yards to work with, and he was gaining 3. Or they'd basically have him stopped at the handoff point, and he'd gain 2 yards on it. And those are the kind of runs that they don't show up great on the stat sheet, but when you look at it with a back like him, those are what make a back like him so valuable and so worth the money. Takk McKinley was dominating too. I'm excited to see Takk McKinley this coming week because of how well he did last week. He was beating Andrew Whitworth like a steel drum. I can't wait to see him go up against Hala Vaitai. Like, Takk was just killing it. And then the other guy I thought did really well was Desmond Trufant. I went back and watched it in all 22, and Trufant was everywhere. He was on his dude. He was so good in coverage that they didn't target him, but I think 3 or 4 times all game. And outside of the one deep catch, which was just a ridiculous catch and throw, I didn't see him do anything I didn't see him do anything bad in technique or anything wrong on those plays. He just has a bad play here and there where a guy is going to beat him. And it wasn't even him doing anything bad. It's just sometimes corners get beat.
Yeah, exactly, Scott. Cornerbacks get beat, but the knock on Desmond Trufant is he's given up a few more touchdowns than he's used to giving up, and I think what ends up happening is, particularly when it comes to people watching cornerbacks play, they see a guy get beat for a touchdown and they think, oh, he stinks and he's bad, he's not playing well. When it's just basically focusing on one play. But yeah, I think you're right with the sort of the top performances. I thought, in addition to some of those guys, I thought Deion Jones had a great game. Damontae Casey, while I still was a little skeptical about his abilities as a gunner on punt team because he was nowhere to be seen when Farrell Cooper was fielding the ball, he certainly made the most of his opportunities on kickoff team, forced a fumble, and I think he was responsible for recovering or was in the mix for recovering that muffed punt by Cooper early in the game. So a lot of positives for the Falcons overall. And not too many negatives this week. The biggest negative is a couple of guys didn't necessarily Levine Toilolo didn't have a monster game, but what is that? That's just a normal Levine Toilolo game. So a lot of positive for the Falcons and certainly an impressive performance, even though the Rams defensive line did do a number on them. Let's move into some of these mailbag questions pertaining to this Rams game. Of course, we got the first one comes from Evan Birchfield. He asks, who's the brother of the week for the Rams game? For those of you that do not know, the brother of the week is what Evan wants to know is who's the player that performed the best that won't get all the headlines. For myself, I'm going to choose Brian Poole. I thought Brian Poole, while he did get beat on that Cooper Cup touchdown, that was a well executed rub route by the Rams. No real fault, in my opinion, for really Brian Poole losing that matchup. That just is one of those things that happens. I thought he did an excellent job in run support. And I just want to give Brian Poole a shout out because we talked about him on the previous episode. We didn't say anything negative about him, but we did talk about how, the possibility that, the Falcons could decide to upgrade that spot this offseason. Of course, he came in and made a couple of big plays in this game. And of course, if maybe Brian Poole's out there listening to the show or watching the show right now, and if we are motivating you to play better, Brian Poole, then I guess we'll talk some more trash this week or something like that. Because if you can make a couple of plays, get an interception or a pick against Philadelphia, then that would be greatly appreciated.
I guess for me, I'd have to give it to Wes Schweitzer. Going into this game, I wasn't expecting him to handle Aaron Donald really at all. And I think there was a handful of plays that he had issues. But outside of those, I thought Schweitzer won that battle. He was able to push him off the ball. He was able to control his guy. And then when Brockers was in front of him, it was just like a standard defensive lineman was in front of him. And he was able to hold up well. Schweitzer has really impressed me throughout the year. And just with his play, he was holding up well in pass pro for the most part. And, they were putting him one-on-one against Donald all day. And Donald was creating penetration, but he was pushing him wide. So he wasn't hitting Matt Ryan. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, he keeps getting beat. But the goal at right guard is just to not let your guy hit the quarterback. You have to maintain the depth of the pocket, but if the guy's going to beat you, treat it like you're an outside tackle, and you just push him wide as far as you can. So I thought he did a good job maintaining his bearing and maintaining what he was supposed to do at right.
Definitely. Yeah, I thought Schweitzer, as all the Falcons interior players, or really all the Falcons offensive linemen, Aaron Donald got the better of them. He had a monster performance. He finished with a Pro Football Focus grade of like a 97.8, which is, not a perfect score, but pretty much as close as you can reasonably expect a person to get. So he had a monster game. He beat up on Ben Garland probably the most in the game, but he got the better of Alex Mack. He got the better of Wes Schweitzer. He got the better of Ryan Schrader. I think maybe Jake Matthews was the only player to emerge unscathed in the game. But I did think along those lines, Scott, Schweitzer did play really well and certainly was playing a lot better in the second half. And I think was sort of instrumental to the Falcons' running game picking up in the third quarter and later in the game, where, not to say that he was like clearing holes, but his ability to sort of keep Donald contained, keep Donald from knifing through the backfield as well as other Rams D linemen, I think was a big part of why the Falcons were able to establish the run in the second half of that game, take control of the game.
I completely agree.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Comes from Bruce Luong at ATL Bruce Luong. He has the Falcons player that surprised you versus the Rams, good or bad?
I'm going to give the same answer as the brother of the week, Wes Schweitzer. I was expecting him to get absolutely dominated all day, and he held his own. He did what he was supposed to do out there. I mean, it's just, I was just kind of shocked to see how well he played and how well he did technically. He still has a little bit to go. He still has to get a little stronger. He still has to work on his technique some more. But for a first-year starter at right guard, for essentially a rookie, because he didn't see any snaps last year, I mean, he did way better than I was expecting. Especially for a guy who was drafted in the 6th round. He's only going to go.
Yeah, I'll pick the person who I was originally going to pick until I decided to go with Brian Poole for the brother of the week. I'm going to go with Brooks Reed. I thought Brooks Reed played really well going up against Andrew Whitworth. He busted out that spin move a couple of times and made Whitworth look pretty silly in a lot of instances. I was not, I think Whitworth, if you go off the Pro Football Focus grades, I think he had like a 39 grade in this game, which is really bad. And it wasn't just Brooks Reed, but it was also Tack McKinley and Adrian Claiborne, and a couple of times with Devondre Campbell even made him look bad. And, of all those guys, I would have, Claiborne getting the better of him, not a surprise. Tack getting the better of him, not a surprise. But Brooks Reed getting the better of him multiple times, I thought that was a pretty big surprise. So kudos to Brooks Reed, an unheralded pass rusher for the Falcons this season. And he was the player that really surprised me. Bruce's next question is, what we saw during the second half on offense, could this team be headed back to last year's form?
I don't know about that. They still have to. I mean, I don't think this team will ever be back to last year's form, just because last year's form was insane, and there was a good bit of luck involved with what they were doing as well. I mean, as long as they continue to stop dropping balls like they've been, I thought they did a good job of hauling in catches this past week. I think there was maybe 2 drops the entire game. Just a good, clean game is what they needed. And the big thing that was last year was all the 20-plus yard plays, the 40-plus yard plays. They didn't have those this year. So that's still going to be an issue. But as long as they can continue to play the way they're supposed to play and catch all the balls they're supposed to catch, you'll see something big on offense eventually. And maybe it's this week. Maybe it's in 2 weeks if they win. Maybe it's in 4 weeks if they keep winning. So I don't know when it'll happen or if it'll happen, but I do feel like the defense has a little bit of has a little bit to do with the offense. That I think a big reason why that offense last year was as good as it was because the defense was in short fields, the special teams was creating better field position, and the turnovers that they were causing, the offense was capitalizing and turning them into touchdowns. So I think if the defense can continue to give the offense short fields, continue to create turnovers, allow them to capitalize on it, we'll see maybe not the same offense as last year, but something a lot closer to something.
Yeah, I would say, Bruce, I do not expect the Falcons offense to get back to last year's form. I think what they did in the second half was they relied on the running game. They relied on their short passing game. They ran a lot more screens to offset the Rams' pass rush. They ran a lot more bootlegs, which were designed to basically get Matt Ryan out of the pocket and away from Aaron Donald. And so, they sort of dinked and dunked their way, and it was effective. With the lead, they were able to control the ball. They dominated time of possession. I think they held it for almost 38 minutes in this game, and had a big, long drive at the start of the third quarter. I don't think that is necessarily last year's form. I think last year's form, as Scott said, is a high-powered, explosive offense that would have dropped Matt Ryan or rolled Matt Ryan out of the pocket and hit Julio Jones for a 60-yard touchdown. That would have been more like last year's form. But I do think the Falcons, we could see glimpses of last year's offense on a drive here or there in these upcoming weeks with their ability to run the football, with their ability to dial up play action off of that, with their ability to get the balls in the hands of their playmakers and let those guys cook after the catch. Sanu had a big play on a screen pass that set up the Falcons' final score. So, yeah, I think those are the things that, are reminiscent of last year. But in terms of them putting it all together and dropping a 30-burger or a 40-burger on either the Eagles or the Vikings or the Saints in the next couple of weeks, I don't think that's likely to be in the cards. Evan Birchfield asks, do you think the Rams being a young team and resting their starters in Week 17 hurt them? He also says, congrats on your marriage, Scott. And a similar question from Brian at your homie Brian. He asks, do you guys agree that the Rams were their best opening round matchup we could have possibly gotten? I think experience helped us get confidence-boosting win, and I thought it would be best if we played the Rams rather than the Saints or Panthers in the first round.
I do think for the Falcons, the Rams were the easiest matchup they could have gotten in the first round. I also think the Eagles are the best matchup they could have gotten in the second round. Just because I look at the quarterbacks. It's not as much the experience of the team as a whole, it's the experience of the quarterback as a whole. So there are people who just kind of look at these teams and they're like, well, the Rams were inexperienced. The Rams aren't a good team. The Rams were resting starters. We said, I don't think any of that really had to do with it. I think the Falcons knew the moment, and I think had the Falcons played this Rams team in the regular season, the result wouldn't have been much different. I think the Falcons were just a better team that won on the day in a result that we would have seen normally. And that's not to say that the Rams aren't good. Rams are a good young team. I'm scared to see them next year or the year after. But I thought this past week just kind of showed where they were. They didn't have a hard schedule. Teams they were playing this year, weren't exactly world beaters. And they put up a 12-4 record against. Sorry, 12-4, 11. They put up an 11-5 record. They put up an 11-5 record against lesser competition. I mean, they played the Colts. Their wins are against the Colts, the 49ers, the Cowboys, the Jaguars, the Cardinals, the Giants, the Texans, minus J.J. Watt and Whitney Merciless, the Cardinals, and the Titans. The only impressive victories that you could say that they had were games against the Saints and Seahawks, the Jaguars. Outside of those three games, they played a lot of teams.
Okay. I don't think it diminishes the quality of the Falcons' victory by suggesting that the Rams did not put their best foot forward. I do think resting their starters in Week 17, I generally think resting your starters in Week 17 is a bad idea, particularly for teams that are offensively oriented like the Rams are. I do think that you need to have your offense in a rhythm. And for a young team, if the Rams, this was like the fourth year that the Rams have been to back-to-back postseasons, then yeah, I could understand why they might want to rest their starters. I know the Colts did that quite a bit, but I also noticed many times over the years that the Colts would rest their starters in Week 17, and those often were the years that they would be one and done in the playoffs. They would get that bye, and then they would get beat in the second round of the playoffs. So I generally am not a fan of resting your starters. I don't think there's really a net benefit of it. I think, obviously you don't want guys to get injured, but I do think you need to play guys, particularly quarterbacks, offensive linemen, wide receivers early in games, and you can sort of feel it out. And then if the game isn't necessarily going the way that you want it to go after a quarter or so, then you can kind of pull guys. I think the Eagles played it right with their Week 17 game against Dallas. They played their starters for a quarter, pulled them. They didn't really do a whole lot in that first quarter. But you can't, basically, when you have a bye like that, you can't give them 2 weeks off. I think that had a factor in the game. The Rams have been the league's fastest starting team. I think the fact that they got off to a slow start in this game obviously is testament, one, to the Falcons' defensive performance, but also because they were a little bit out of sync. And I think you can attribute that to their youth, their inexperience, and the fact that they basically took the previous week off. Let's move on and talk about this upcoming matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles. The Falcons are favored against a 13-3 Eagles team, the number one seed in the NFC. Eagles are 7-1 at home. Their only loss being that Week 17 game where they pulled their starters against Dallas. The Eagles have given up only 13.4 points per game at home, which is the second best in the league behind the Minnesota Vikings. I know people will say, oh, they haven't played anybody, but I don't care who you haven't played. If you're only giving up 13 points to NFL offenses over the course of a season, that's pretty good. Interestingly, both teams are pretty much healthy. The Falcons, all their guys that have been limited in practice this week are expected to play, even though there was a couple of guys that were limited today. The Eagles, basically their only two major injuries are Sidney Jones, who's got a hamstring injury and is questionable. And, I think 2 weeks ago was his first NFL game. So I don't know if his presence is going to make a huge difference. And
I'm not worried about him.
Yeah. Donnell Ellerbe is the starting middle linebacker. He's got a hamstring injury. He is expected to play because he was a full participant today in practice, but he was limited this week. So that's, basically Sidney Jones is really the only player that's, on either team's roster that's in a position where he probably might not play this weekend, and that's not a big deal. So two teams at relatively full strength. Obviously, this late in the season, guys aren't necessarily 100%, and some guys probably aren't really 90%, but obviously in these important games, they will give it their go, give it their best, and see what's what. For me, some of the key matchups, this is a game where last last season we saw the Eagles dominate the Falcons in the trenches, dominated defensive line, dominated that game. Their offensive line dominated that game. Obviously, Jason Peters is not in this game. He's been replaced by Halapalu Vaitai. I think I got that right.
I just call him Hala Vaitai.
Yeah,
it's so much easier. They call him Hala.
Yeah. And obviously Carson Wentz, who was probably the front runner to be the MVP had he stayed healthy, is not in this game. So those are two critical injuries that will not be on the field for the Eagles and may make the difference. But the Eagles are going to probably basically take the same blueprint that they had last year, which is we're going to run the football. We know Nick Foles has not been playing well as of late, so we're going to take the ball out of his hands, put it in Jay Ajayi's hands, put it in LeGarrette Blount's hands. Ajayi is the only running back prior to Todd Gurley that rushed for over 100 yards against the Falcons this season, back when he was with the Miami Dolphins in week 5, week 6, or whatever that was. They'll rely on their defense, and they have arguably the best defensive line in the league, and they'll probably try to take advantage of Ben Garland and Wes Schweitzer with obviously Fletcher Cox. Besides Aaron Donald's the number 1 highest graded defensive interior lineman according to Pro Football Focus. The number 2 guy is Fletcher Cox. So those interior guys will not get a break this week. They like to put Brandon Graham on the inside as well in nickel situations. They obviously have Timmy Jernigan, who's one of the better young penetrating defensive tackles also in the league. And, of course, Derek Barnett, Vinny Curry, Chris Long also make up that rotation. So no one is getting a week off this week for the Falcons offensive line, and it'll be important for all those guys. If the Eagles can control this game in the trenches like they did a year ago, it's not necessarily a good look for the Falcons, but hopefully the Falcons are prepared for that and will certainly rise up, as it were, to get the job done. Scott, what are some of the other things that you're looking forward to seeing in this game?
I'm looking forward to seeing what Julio Jones does this week. I think that's the key to this game. You need the offensive line to block, but I think you could get away with running a 6 or 7-man protection with who the Eagles' corners are. Darby didn't do well against Jones in the past, and Jalen Mills can't handle him, period. So I think if you have Julio out there, you could easily, Julio out there full 100%, you could easily treat it like it's the first Tampa Bay game and just target him 15 to 20 times and see what happens.
Yeah, I think, we talk about the Falcons offense taking a step forward. They're going to have to ride the running game and Julio Jones throughout this postseason. So if they can get Julio Jones going, that makes their job a whole lot easier, because the running game is probably not going to be something they're going to be able to rely upon this week, because the Eagles' run defense is one of the best in the league because of that defensive line. So Julio, I'm with you on that one, Scott.
Also, the tight ends against their linebackers. I don't think Bradham's great in coverage, and then they've got Ellerbe starting. And as much as I like Donnell Ellerbe, he's not a very good. He's just not a very good coverage linebacker.
Yeah, that's fair, and that's one of the reasons why they pull him on nickel situations. Okay, let's get into some of these mailbag questions pertaining to this matchup. Evan Birchfield asks, the Eagles are being painted as the underdog by the media. Do you see it that way?
I mean, I don't. I don't think Nick Foles is a good quarterback, and I think the Falcons' defense should be able to hold him pretty easily. But their defense is nasty. Their run game is nasty. If the Falcons want to win this game, they've got to tackle well on defense. They got to be able to hold them to under 4 yards of carry. Really, really tough defenses win championships. And the Falcons are going to have to show that they have a really, really tough defense. Because with who they have on offense, getting into the defense, if the defense can do their shit, the rest of it all comes together. They got to create the turnovers. They got to stop the run. They do the rest of it, I think they'll be fine.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think the Eagles, Vegas thinks the Eagles are the underdog, but Vegas does that, so they can make money. But yeah, I think it's fair to think that the Falcons, if I think what's the line, like 1.5 or 2.5 or something like that. I don't know what
Yeah,
it
it's
is
not
currently.
small.
So that basically means that if this game was played at a neutral field, then the Falcons would be favored by what, like 1 point or something like that. I don't know. For some reason my brain's not working. So I think that's fair. I think, um, or maybe the Eagles would be favored by 1 point. I can't do math in my head. I'm sorry, guys. So like I think it's fair. Like I certainly am not taking the Eagles lightly, but I don't necessarily disagree with anybody that thinks the Falcons are the better team in this, largely because the Falcons have a better quarterback, a more reliable running game, and better weapons at the wide receiver position. But the Eagles certainly, and this is not to disparage the Falcons defense, but the Eagles certainly is a much better defense, or at least has performed at a much better, higher level throughout this 2017 season than the Falcons have. You can say that over the last like 5 or 6 games, the Falcons have sort of closed the gap, but the Eagles have been at the top of the league since week one and been dominating teams, since week one. And, at home, they've played lights out this year. So it's one of those things where it's like, I understand why people paint the Eagles as the underdog, but it's a slight underdog in my eyes. So, yeah. Evan Birchfield asks, what can the Falcons player expect atmosphere-wise in Philly compared to what they dealt with in LA?
Completely different. Philly fans actually give a shit. To put it nicely, like Philly fans are some of the most loyal, defensive, semi-crazy fans that you'll find out there.
Fully crazy.
I'm trying to be nice. But yeah, last time the Falcons went up to Philly, I think it was like 2012, and they went up last year. I think last time they went to Philly, it was always going to be a environment. As long as the Falcons don't get out, whatever.
You're cutting out over there, Scott. I couldn't hear those last couple of things that you said.
Oh, sorry. I'm just saying, like, Philly has crazy fans, and they'll find ways to win out.
Okay. Yeah, I think, it's a completely different atmosphere. It's going to be a much more hostile environment than the Rams game was. No offense to Rams fans, but I think one of the reasons why the Rams are only 4-4 at home is because they don't really have a home field advantage yet in that stadium, in the Coliseum. It's a college stadium. That is not, the Philly fans are notorious, infamous for throwing batteries at Santa Claus. Anybody that is not a Philadelphian or an Eagle that plays in that stadium is not going to get a welcome reception. So it's going to be a much more hostile environment, comparable to when the Falcons go and play the Saints in that stadium. It's not going to be the best place. The weather is not going to be as good. It's going to be cold. It's going to be wet. It's supposed to rain all day Friday in Philly. It's supposed to rain in the morning on Philly. The latest projections I've seen is the temperatures are going to be close to freezing, if not slightly below freezing by the time kickoff starts. So it is not going to be the ideal scenario for a team like the Falcons, who rely heavily on their speed. And it's going to play a little bit more to the Philadelphia Eagles' strength, which is more their physicality, particularly along the line of scrimmage. But, the Falcons certainly have what it takes to overcome those issues. But certainly I do think there is a legitimate home field advantage for the Eagles in this game. I think the Falcons can overcome it, but it's not going to be a cakewalk. It's not going to be as easy a challenge as going into LA and beating the Rams team. Two similar questions. One is from Brian at your homie Brian. And the other one is from Bruce. Brian's question is, how well do you think the matchup with the Eagles? How well do you think we match up with the Eagles in all three phases? And Bruce asks, key factors to beat the Eagles.
So I think the Falcons match up with the Eagles pretty well um, in all three phases, except for maybe O line versus D line. But I think the Falcons have a great D line, a good to great offensive line, and the Eagles have a great defensive line. So that's a battle to watch more than like do the Falcons get dominated there. I think at the second and third levels of the Eagles defense, they don't match up with the Falcons offense at all. I think Atlanta can dominate that matchup. I think the Falcons have a better defensive line than the Eagles have offensive line, at least on the left side of the offensive line. I think the Falcons have better middle linebackers, than the Eagles have, say, tight ends and running backs. I think the Falcons have better corners than the Eagles have receivers. It's just, will they execute? This is a game about execution. The Falcons should win this game. I don't know about by how much, but they should win this game. They should be able to go in there, beat Philadelphia in a hard-fought battle, probably like 24-21, and just do their thing. They just have to execute. No turnovers on offense, 8 turnovers on defense. Don't have the special teams screw up. I think both teams have middling special teams units too. I don't think either team has, especially with Aaron Sproles out and using their returner. So I don't think the kick or return teams are going to be. If either team gets a big play from the kick return team, it's more the other team screwed up than they did.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think you're right there, Scott. I think in terms of special teams, all the numbers I've seen indicate that that's pretty close. If anybody has an edge, I guess maybe the Eagles have a slight edge there. But hopefully that won't be a major factor in the game. In terms of how they match up in their phases, obviously I think the Falcons' offense is better than the Eagles' offense, but I think the Eagles' defense is better than the Falcons' defense. But you're not really matching defense with the defense; you're matching defense to offense. And so I think the Falcons are certainly, I would give the Eagles defense probably the edge in that matchup because I do think the Eagles do some of the things really well, like stop the run, that the Falcons really heavily rely on. I think the Falcons will have to make adjustments to handle that. I don't expect the Falcons to rush for a bunch of yards in this game, and I do expect the Falcons to rely on their short, quick pass game like they did against the Rams, like they did against the Panthers, to help offset some of the mismatches that they're going to have, particularly in the defensive interior. I think in terms of the Eagles' offense versus the Falcons' defense, obviously I give the Falcons the edge there. I do think the Eagles' offense is probably not getting as much credit as it deserves just because of Nick Foles, being Nick Foles. But I do think in terms of their skill position players, I think they present some potentially more troubling matchups than the Rams receivers did, even though I think on paper most people would think the Rams receivers are better. But I think Aguilar is a much tougher matchup for Brian Poole in the slot than Cooper Kupp was. I think Alshon Jeffrey, given his size, while not the big-time playmaker that Sammy Watkins is and the vertical threat that Sammy Watkins is, I certainly think he's a bigger factor in the red zone potentially, and that could mean the difference, the difference of 4 points if he can make a play in the red zone. I certainly think Zach Ertz is light years better than Tyler Higbee is for the Rams. So, I expect Keanu Neal and Devondre Campbell to hold their own against Zach Ertz, but Zach Ertz is Zach Ertz, and he, it's not like they're going to – I don't expect them to shut him down by any means. So I do think, the Eagles have a little bit more at the skill positions than people want to give them credit for because they're too focused on Foles. But I still think the Falcons certainly have what it takes to match up with those guys, and they shouldn't, they'll get theirs. There'll be a couple of plays here and there where the Eagles will take advantage, but I certainly don't expect the Eagles to put up 24, 28, or 30 points against this defense. And there's a decent chance that we can hold in the single digits. So I think the key factors to beating the Eagles is going to be not getting dominated in the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball, staying balanced on offense, but being able to rely on your passing game to sort of offset any struggles the running game has, and creating pressure on Nick Foles and forcing the Eagles to throw to win rather than doing what they want to do, which is run the ball down our throats. Next question comes from Jean Kevin Hong. He asks, how were the Giants' offense so successful against the Eagles' defense in Week 15? And what do you think our offense should do to score 25 points this Saturday? I actually did go back and watch this game. I watched every snap of the Giants' offense on the All-22 to try to figure out. And the Giants did what some of the stuff I talked about, which was they relied a lot on the short, quick passing game to their running backs. Darkwa and Gallman combined for, I think, about 15 targets. They also threw a lot to Sterling Shepard in the slot. They ran a lot of slants and whatnot with Shepard, trying to attack the middle of the Eagles' defense, that linebacker core where they're vulnerable, where when Malcolm Jenkins would drop down in the slot and cover, they would attack him as well. They also got a lot of targets to Evan Ingram. I think Ingram and Shepard combined for 29 targets in that game. They basically used Ingram a little bit like basically like a wide receiver that occasionally would line up, with his hand in the dirt. That's basically what Ingram is. And then they got some big plays thanks to some double moves. They got some big plays because a couple of Eagles DBs, made some mental mistakes, took a bad angle here or there, missed a tackle. And they got some breaks because of, there was a fourth down where the Giants were about to punt, and the Eagles player jumped off sides, and that gave the Giants a first down, and then they wound up scoring like 3 plays later. There was a time where an Eagles DB got flagged in the end zone on a third down that led to a new set of downs. If not for I think it was a defensive holding call, that the Giants would have settled for a field goal, but they wound up scoring a touchdown a couple of plays later. So it was 11 points that the Eagles gave up in that game, largely due to mental mistakes and breakdowns on that side of the ball. But it was a lot of sort of dink and dunk with the Giants, ball control stuff. And I think that's really what the Falcons going to have to rely on. I don't expect Freeman and Coleman to have a big game on the ground. I do think they could have a big game in the air. I don't think I like Austin Hooper a lot, but he's not the type of receiver that Evan Ingram is. They're just different styles of players. So I don't expect Hooper to have a big game, but he certainly will be a factor on third downs. I do think instead of using Sterling Shepard in the slot, I do think the Falcons will try to use a lot of Julio in the slot. And over these last 4 or 5 games, when they've used Julio in the slot, they like to target Julio a lot when he goes to the slot. So when you're watching the game on Saturday, when you see Julio lined up in the slot, there's a very good possibility that the ball is going to him on that given play, assuming the offensive line holds up. So I think that's really going to be what the Falcons' game plan is.
I mean, I agree with that. I do think the Falcons might be a little more effective in the run game than the Giants, just because the Giants' offensive line is atrocious. But the short out routes, I also disagree with the idea that Hooper's not the kind of guy that can go out there and run a whole bunch of 5-yard slant routes and 5-yard ins and 5-yard outs. I mean, I think that's probably what he should be doing more often than not. He's not the kind of guy who should be going out there and running streaks down the field, just because that's really not his game. So let him run those ins, those outs, those posts, those slants. Basically give him a route tree similar to what Tony Gonzalez used to run here, and just let him go to work. I think he could hit it. The short curl, the in, the out, the short slants. Let him run those and just see what happens. And I think he will do very well against those linebackers. And use Taylor Gabriel. The Eagles don't have a good slot. Use Taylor Gabriel all day. Just have him in the slot, have him out wide, and have Sanu eat against the slot corner. Just attack the interior of their defense. I don't think their safeties are great. I don't think their corners are great. I think you could have a field day with them as long as the offensive line protects. And I'm always down for the idea of put in Tevin Coleman and Devontae Freeman, and whoever you don't have in there for protection, send out a short outlet route in case you need it. But keep running what you've been running, and it doesn't hurt to run the ball 25 times just to keep it honest.
Okay. Next question. comes from Evan Birchfield. Score prediction. What's your Scott?
I do think the Falcons win this one. If I had to guess, I'd say 24-21. Hard-fought battle. People looking at the game like, oh, man, the Falcons had this opportunity here to really blow it up, and, oh, the Eagles had this opportunity there to really come back. So for me, that's the kind of game we want to see. Basically just a hard-fought battle. Atlanta should do ball control again this week like they did the last game, and just go to work. Because I think they held the ball for 35 minutes against the Rams, unless I'm wrong. 37. Yeah, 37 minutes against the Rams. Do the same thing against the Eagles. Don't let the Eagles touch them. Play ball control. Don't let Nick Foles try and beat himself. And just, if he does get the ball, and he is holding on to it too long, he's going to beat himself. Like, if you put him in a situation where he got the ball for 35 minutes, he only gets 25, and he's down most of the time, 10 points, good ball.
For me, the Falcons are winless when they don't score 20 points. I think this will be the first win that they get this year when they don't score 20 points. I have a lot of respect for this Eagles defense. I think they will limit this Falcons offense more than most, but I also am confident the Falcons defense in these low scoring games will be able to do enough to keep the Eagles offense in check. So I'm thinking like a 19-13 game. I'm thinking like 4 field goals for Matt Bryant, and probably like 2 field goals for whoever the Eagles kicker is, Cody Parkey. I don't know if he's still there. So I think this is going to be a field goal game. I think that both defenses are going to be very stingy with giving up yards. I think both defenses are going to be very stingy when the opposing team gets into the red zone. And I think there's going to be a lot of teams settling for 3 points instead of 7 points when they get into the red zone. I don't think there's going to be a lot of touchdowns. And so I think there's going to be a very hard-fought, close game back and forth. It's going to come down to the final possession. But I'm confident the Falcons will be able to take care of business 19-13. Okay. Let's get to the call-outs of the week before we get to the rest of the mailbag. This is the section where occasionally, not every week, but occasionally there is something that bothers Scott and I, and we get a couple of minutes to rant and rave about it. I will go first. And I think it was interesting because we talked about this a little bit at the top of the show. The thing that is, I'm going to call out people that let 1 or 2 plays define a player's season. You hear it a lot with Desmond Trufant. You hear it a lot with Austin Hooper. I think a lot of people look at a couple of negative plays that a player has. In the case with Desmond Trufant, because he's given up 6 touchdowns this year. In the case of Austin Hooper, because he's had a couple of drops in some critical moments of games. And they act like those, 3 or 4 bad drops by Hooper or those 6 touchdowns by Desmond Trufant is what defines their season when it's really not. A lot of people would be surprised to know that Austin Hooper finished in the top 15 among tight ends in receiving and receptions and receiving yards. In DVOA, he was top 5 in catch rate. Even though he had unreliable hands, he caught over 75% of his passes, which was in the top 5 among tight ends and one of the best marks on this team. So that narrative that, he doesn't have great hands and he's not a reliable receiver is just generally not true. Sure, he dropped too many passes than we would have wanted. Had he not dropped those passes, he would have probably led the league in terms of having the highest catch rate in the league. So, I think what I'm getting at is I think people let a couple of plays define a player's season for whatever reason because, they don't like a player. They get upset during the games and they don't take a step back and look at the bigger picture. And when you look at the bigger picture of Austin Hooper, he's had a excellent second year. He's made significant gains from his first year where he was basically starting in the second half of the season for Jacob Tamme and really wasn't a major factor in any game outside of maybe 1 or 2 games. He's been a reliable option on third downs, even though the Falcons' red zone offense hasn't been as great as it was a year ago. He's been one of the better options in the red zone that they've had as well. And the same thing goes with Desmond Trufant. The touchdowns is bad. He's given up a couple of big plays, but a lot of those times have been instances where teams are attacking the Falcons' coverages, like the one to Robert Woods last week. That was more a cover 3 beater than necessarily Trufant gotten beat. The touchdown he gave up to Ted Ginn was Ricardo Allen basically leaving him out to dry in that single high roll. And like Trufant's given up the same amount of completions as Robert Alford. He's given up about the same amount of yards, right? He's one of the least targeted cornerbacks in the league. So that basically means that cornerbacks are afraid of him, just as afraid of him now as they were a couple of years ago. So all the talk that, Trufant's being overpaid, he's not worth it, they should get rid of him, they should have never given him money, whatever, he's declining, all that type of stuff, it's just not true just because people get upset over a couple of plays here or there. So those are the people I'm calling out. You got to pump the brakes on the hot takes, wait till the season's over, look at the guy's entire season before you start calling someone a disappointment or a declining player. And the reality is that they're not, and you're just making a bigger deal out of a handful of plays that you didn't like.
It's fair. I agree with that. You can't tell in 6-7 plays what a guy is. You just can't. Especially when the other 994 plays he has on the field the rest of the season, he's excellent. I don't get it.
Who are you calling out this week, Scott?
I'm going to call out Chris Collinsworth for being a lazy asshole. How many times do you have to mention the Super Bowl? We are 18 weeks into the season. This is a completely different team. And you continually mention the Super Bowl. I counted 8 instances of it. 8 during the game. Had I been playing a drinking game with shots, I would have been done by the end of that game. Especially since I was already feeling a buzz after my wedding. I would have been done. So, why are you so lazy? Come up with a new thing. Come up with something else other than, oh, this is the team that... No, it's not. Completely different team. That team didn't have this team defense. That team didn't have this team run game. That team didn't have this team's grit. This team played in a lot of rough games. In a lot of games they should have lost. They did. That builds the grit that they have. That builds the kind of team that this is. They shouldn't have beat the Bears by just 6. That was weak. They shouldn't have had to wait for a call against the Lions. That's ridiculous. They shouldn't have lost. They should have shown up against the Patriots. The game against the Panthers in Carolina. The game that they could have come out. The game against the Saints. They had the fights. Sorry, they had the second. This is give up. May not have that.
Yeah.
Impressive.
Yeah, a lot of, a lot of games the Falcons lost this season that I was very upset about. But now that I look back at it, the Dolphins game is one of those games that people constantly bring up. But, the thing I realized last week was if the Falcons had beaten the Dolphins, they would have been the 5 seed, and they wouldn't have played the Rams in the first round of playoffs. And so maybe they wouldn't be here right now going into the second round of the playoffs. So, all the struggles that the Falcons went through this year, however frustrating they have been, however mind-numbingly stupid they have looked at times, it'll all be worth it in the long run if they continue to win. So, I have forgiven the Falcons for being bad early on in the season, and hopefully they will pay back my kindness by winning a Super Bowl this year. So we'll see what happens. Okay. ATL Sports 404 asks, could the Falcons draft another offensive lineman this year, or could they stand pat with Schweitzer, Garland, Harlow in the mix with a potential Levitri return?
The only way they draft an offensive lineman is if Levitri doesn't agree to a restructuring of his deal that gives him a couple more years here in Atlanta. That's the only thing I can see. Levitri's been very good this year. He's worth keeping. Garland, he's a good, solid reserve at center and guard. Harlow, we don't know what Harlow is. I wasn't impressed with him with what I saw, but maybe there's something there. So drafting another offensive line, I do think it's going to happen at some point, whether it's a guard or a tackle. But I think it's more likely we see a tackle drafted that can eventually take over for Ryan Schrader more than a guy who can eventually take over for Andy Levitri.
Yeah, it's always a possibility. We're 4.5 months away from the draft, basically. So a lot of stuff will happen in free agency that will determine, all this draft stuff. So right now it's just pure speculation. I don't think the Falcons need to draft a guard. I think they can stand pat with Schweitzer. I think they can stand pat with Garland. I think, Harlow did not have the greatest preseason to make you think that he's ready to be a starter, but I think he showed development over the course of the summer. From game 1 to game 4, he was probably the most improved player on the Falcons, but you can arguably say that's because he was so bad in the first game. But I think the Falcons certainly want to give him another year to see what he develops before they decide to use a high pick on a guard to basically say, oh, we've given up on Sean Harlow, just like I don't think they're ready to give up on Wes Schweitzer. Now, depending on Levitri's situation, I think will determine how much of a priority guard is. If Levitri retires, which I don't think would happen, but it's a possibility, then that obviously opens up a hole there that the Falcons might address early in the draft. I personally think the strategy should be the Falcons should be prepared to re-sign him. I know he's coming off a triceps injury that will probably cause him to miss a majority of the offseason, but I also think, that's somewhat a blessing in disguise to a certain extent because it means that he won't necessarily have the bargaining power to get the max deal that he could get. So that could ultimately save the Falcons a little bit of money and also allow Andy Levitri to stay potentially a year or two longer because the Falcons won't feel compelled a year from now or 2 years from now to have to cut him because his salary cap is too high. So I think it might wind up working out for both parties in the long run. I think Levitri still has shown he has plenty left in the tank and deserves to come back at least for the 2018 season. So I hope they do bring him back. I think Schweitzer, while he's struggled throughout the season, I think has shown flashes, particularly early in the season, going up against some quality tackles that he can hold his own. He's got still improve and develop, but I'm willing to give him that opportunity. I agree with Scott. I think if the Falcons are going to draft an offensive lineman this year, it makes a lot more sense to draft a swing tackle, somebody that can be developed for the next year or two behind Ryan Schrader, someone that can give him some insurance in case, for whatever reason, Jake Matthews gets hurt or whatever, and is a much better player than Ty Sambrailo has proven so far in his career. Sambrailo wasn't awful for the Falcons this year, but certainly didn't show anything to indicate that, his issues that he showed in Denver are over. So I think the Falcons need some depth at the offensive tackle position if they're going to take an offensive lineman in the draft. I think that's the smart move to go. Brian asks, if we get past the Eagles, who do you think we have the best chance against in the NFC Championship game? The experience of Drew Brees, Sean Payton, and the Saints, or the Vikings and that scary defense?
I'd rather see the Vikings, honestly. Playing the Saints 3 times in a row is fine. I don't hate the idea of playing against the Saints, but going down to New Orleans again, and the way the Falcons always seem to get jobbed in New Orleans, whether it's the refs or some stupid fucking situation where the Saints are just destroying them on the field, I'd rather just not have to deal with the Saints in the NFC Championship if they win. Now, the Vikings, I can deal with the Vikings. Vikings fans aren't going to sit there and dominate my timeline going, Falcons fans, because I just have to be like, dude, 1999 NFC Championship game. What happened? They go, oh, shut up, man. So, much rather go against the Vikings. Vikings are more than willing to at least be cordial towards us. And I think the Falcons match up better against the Vikings and will play against the Vikings better than they did in the first game because they'll be healthy. If I'm remembering right, the Vikings didn't have to play Devontae Freeman. Or was it Tevin Coleman? Oh, no, they got both of them. Who is it that they didn't play?
It was Trufant and Poole, right?
That's right. It was Trufant and Poole that went down in that game. And the minute Trufant and Poole went down, well, we all saw what happened. So I think the Falcons will do a lot better if they go up against the Vikings in Case Keenum if they were a fully healthy defense and a defense that has Trufant and Poole and Duke Riley and all these guys healthy, ready to go, and they throw out tack a lot more. I think that'll be much better.
Okay. Well, I feel the exact opposite. I want every single part of the Saints in the NFC Championship game. I am outright scared of the Vikings. They have shut down our offense 3 years in a row. I don't see why that would change suddenly with the injuries we've had on the interior offensive line, the struggles we've had in the red zone the last couple of weeks, some of our issues on third and longs. I don't see why suddenly the Falcons would get their act together against the Vikings in the NFC Championship game in their hometown when it's probably like 12 degrees. Doesn't seem to be a situation that favors the Falcons offense at all. I know that people look at the Vikings offense and say, oh, they're not that good, but like they've played lights out this year. So I don't want any part of the Vikings. They've shown Mike Zimmer we can't beat Mike Zimmer. I mean, that's basically been ever since he's been the coach there. We have never really been in any of those games. So I want the Saints. I think we can match up really well with the Saints. I know they have some stars on their offense. They have a couple of stars on their defense. But I think we've shown the last two times we played them that those stars don't really make a huge difference in the game. Kamara's been okay, but nothing special. Our linebackers can handle him. Our safeties can handle him. Ingram has certainly had some plays, but I think our run defense has improved enough that we can keep Ingram contained. The only real concern is Michael Thomas. But I think if it's just the Michael Thomas show, I think that's something that we can deal with. We did so in that Thursday night game, and they've got some injuries on their offensive line, so I feel like we can attack Drew Brees a little bit better. And that defense is good, and Cameron Jordan has been a beast in both games we played, and Marshawn Lattimore has created turnovers, some of them through the magical powers of his tuchus. Those guys have shown in those games, but we've shown that, Lattimore can be beat. Xavier Rhodes has never really struggled against Julio Jones. Lattimore has. So I like that matchup way more. I think if we can block Cameron Jordan, the Saints don't really have anything else on their defensive line to throw. Everson Griffin tore Jake Matthews a new one in that last game. I pray for Jake Matthews that he doesn't have to see Everson Griffin in the NFC Championship game. So I'm all about the Saints. We will have bragging rights for the rest from here to the end of eternity if we beat the Saints in the NFC Championship game. There's obviously a risk that we could lose that game and forever have to hear annoying Saints fans in our timelines for the rest of our lives. But that's a risk I'm willing to work with because I think the Falcons have a much better matchup. So I'll be rooting for the Saints on Sunday, and obviously I'll be rooting for the Falcons, and I'm really excited to see if those two teams match up in the NFC Championship game. All right, next question comes from Jean Kevin Hong. My question for the week is, whenever we have a lead at the end of the game, we seem to intentionally let our opponent eat yards after yards. Some people on Twitter call it preventative D, and other people call it soft zone defense. I want to know what this scheme is called, and if Quinn believes it is a safer way to secure a win.
So it's actually called both. It is called a soft zone. It is called a prevent D. The idea behind it, just the overall concept behind it is, hey, I'm up by, just for an example, I'm up 14 points. There's 4 minutes left in the game. I'm going to call prevent D, and they've got the ball down on their own 25-yard line. So I'm going to give up yardage, and I'm going to guard the sidelines and deep and let them have these catches over the middle for 18, 20 yards because you give up the yardage. It takes them 30 seconds to get up, run a play, gain more yardage. So keep going. And then by the time they get all the way down to the red zone, you're looking at 2 minutes of clock, 2.5 minutes of clock, even farther than that is what's gone off the clock. And they've got maybe, just for an example, 1.5 minutes left, and they're in your red zone. Then you go back to your normal defense because your normal defense is more effective in the red zone. And if they score on you, that's cool. If they don't, whatever. You're already up by 2 touchdowns. You can let them score on you. But, of course, you play regular defense, and you hope they do something stupid like let you get a pick and let you run the clock out. So even if they score it and there's a minute left on the clock, they try the onside kick, you get the onside kick. They try the onside kick, they get the onside kick, you play normal defense. But the idea behind prevent defense is you trade out yardage. And it's perfectly okay to do that when you're up by 2 scores. The problem that people have is that Quinn will do that sometimes by 9 points. And yeah, that's 2 scores, but at the same time, you got to be up by 2 touchdowns.
Well, I mean, look, and specifically in some of these games, watching what the Falcons. Emma, what? I think specifically what the Falcons do on. I'm sorry, got distracted. What the Falcons do in these late game situations, they're not playing prevent defense. Prevent defense is basically we're going to send 4 or 5 guys deep, and we're going to give up, chunks of yardage. You only play prevent in like the last minute of the game. What the Falcons do late in these games, they play cover 3. They, which is basically a defense designed not to give up big plays. It's hard to get big plays on it. And so, the fastest way to score points in the league is to get big plays down the field. And I think, the issue is the goal behind it is similar to what Scott said, is you're going to give up underneath stuff and let teams eat the 6-yard gains, the 8-yard gains, the 10-yard gains, and you're going to make tackles, and they're going to burn clock and all these sorts of things. And it can certainly be problematic. It certainly gives up a bunch of yards to teams, and it's not necessarily a positive thing, but it's understandable. Like, the Falcons aren't necessarily playing I will split the hairs and say cover 3 is not prevent defense. Cover 3 is what half the teams in the league play as their predominant coverage. So it's not as if it's like this naturally soft defense. I think really the Falcons' problem have been with the cover 3 is that for the most part, their linebackers haven't been great when it comes to zone. It's more that, and I think in recent games, the linebacker play has been so much better in coverage that I think they can get away with playing a lot more cover 3 because they've played a lot more cover 3 as the year wore on. They played a lot of cover 3 against the Rams in that game, particularly in the second half once they got the lead. I think we have to make a distinction between the Falcons playing cover 3, which is a perfectly normal, reasonable defense. It was the defense that we expected the Falcons to play when Quinn got here, and then he came to find out that, all these young athletes aren't good in zone, they're better in man coverage, so we have to change to more of a cover 1 type of man-up defense. And now they're sort of switching back more to a cover 3 now that these guys are a little bit more experienced and a little bit more comfortable playing it, and I think it's worked out for them, certainly as of late, more so than it was earlier this season. All right, last question comes from GoGo ATL. My question is for the newlyweds. If it's not too personal, where's the honeymoon?
So we're leaving on the 20th out of Orlando, and we're going on a week-long cruise going to Cozumel, Mexico, Grand Cayman Islands, Ocho Rios, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. So nice week-long cruise. We've already got the drink packages purchased. We've already got all the good stuff purchased. So that's what we'll be doing.
There you go. Scott's going to come back with a little sun.
Maybe a little red.
There you go. All right. So, congratulations, Scott, on your marriage.
Thank
Unfortunately, I
you.
wasn't able to attend. I wish you the best and enjoy your honeymoon in a couple of weeks. And I'm sure whenever that is, we will not have a show that week, or maybe I'll bring on somebody to sit in for you. If the Falcons are playing, certainly I'll try to do that. But if they're not, then who knows? But in the meantime, guys, you can send in your questions to get answered on the mailbag. Use the hashtag Falcons mailbag. You can tweet at the show at Falcons PFC. My Twitter handle is at Falcons. Scott is at Karasik S. You can also hit us up on profootballcentral.com where you can find all the links to the iTunes page. Make sure you give us a thumbs up and like on Facebook, Falcon Central Radio. Make sure you check us out on YouTube. Subscribe at Pro Football Central YouTube page as well as Scott Karasik's YouTube page. Make sure that you can get all the latest on that. And I think we'll be back next week. Your honeymoon is not till the week after, right, Scott?
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, if the Falcons lose, we may just take the week off to take the week off. But
okay, there you go. So we will keep you guys up to date. So definitely check us out. We'll give you any updates on Twitter as well as Facebook on what our plans are for next week's show. But in the meantime, you guys rise up, and hopefully the Falcons take care of business. And we'll be talking about this Eagles win and a potential matchup between our beloved New Orleans Saints or those hated Minnesota Vikings.